The song was called "You Can't Make Old Friends." Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton recorded it in 2013. Neither of them announced at the time that it would be the last song they would ever record together. But both of them understood something that day that the title had already said. The recording session happened quietly, without the kind of production announcement that surrounded their earlier collaborations. There were no press releases about a reunion of country music's most successful duet partnership. There were no promotional photographs taken on the studio steps, no industry excitement about the commercial potential of the pairing. The session was simply a session, booked, executed, and completed in the manner of two professionals who had been doing this long enough to know that a session was a session, and that what it became afterward was determined by something other than the attention it received going in. By 2013, Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton had been one of country music's most celebrated creative partnerships for 30 years. Islands in the Stream, which they had recorded in 1983, had been at #1 for 2 weeks and had crossed from country radio onto pop radio in a way that neither of them had fully anticipated. The song had given both of them access to audiences that their individual careers hadn't reached, and it had established, in the specific way that a culturally embedded hit establishes things, a permanent association between their voices, as if the two of them, whenever they appeared in the same room, carried the memory of that song in with them. Inside the studio that day, the dynamic between Kenny and Dolly was one that long-time observers described as characteristic: easy, warm, professional without being distant, with the specific quality of two people who have spent enough time in the same room that they don't need to manage the atmosphere. Dolly's instinct in the studio was always to find the emotional core of a song quickly, and to trust that core rather than to construct around it. Kenny's instinct was similar, though his approach was slightly more deliberate. He tended to find the story in a lyric and then to tell that story rather than to perform it. Together, they arrived at something that the recording captured without quite being able to explain: the genuine warmth of two people singing about something they had actually lived. Not sentiment manufactured for the occasion, but the real article. The specific ease of two voices that had been in proximity long enough to know where the other one was going. There was a moment in the session, described by people who were present, when the two of them listened back to a take in the control room and said very little. Not because the take was inadequate, it wasn't, but because the song, listened to in playback, said something that they both heard. Something that the studio environment and the professional context and the schedule made it unnecessary to articulate. The song had done the articulating for them. "You Can't Make Old Friends" was released in October 2013 and reached #1 on the country airplay chart, their first #1 together since "Islands in the Stream" 30 years earlier. The symmetry was remarked upon in the coverage, as symmetries usually are. What was less remarked upon was the specific quality of what the record actually was. Not a nostalgia exercise, not a commercial calculation, not two aging artists revisiting past glories, but a genuine statement about something that had been true for 30 years and was, in the recording, being formally acknowledged as true. They had done other things together in the intervening decades: television appearances, duets at industry events, the occasional collaborative recording that reminded audiences the partnership was still alive. But nothing had had the specific commercial and cultural weight of "Islands in the Stream." And by 2013, both of them were at a stage of their careers where the question of what a new collaboration would be was different from what it had been in 1983. In 1983, they had been two artists at their commercial peaks, with everything ahead of them. In 2013, they were two artists who had already been through everything: the peaks, the transitions, the long middle passages of a career that extends far enough to include its own full history. The song they chose was written by Don Schlitz, the same songwriter who had written The Gambler, which was either coincidence or something more deliberate, depending on how much weight you give to the instincts of people who choose songs carefully. You Can't Make Old Friends was, in its subject, a meditation on the specific value of friendships that have survived time. The idea that you can make new friends at any stage of life, but you cannot manufacture the shared history, the accumulated understanding, the particular ease that comes from knowing someone across decades. The old friend is irreplaceable, not because they are better than new friends, but because they are singular, because what they know about you, and what you know about them, is the product of years that cannot be compressed or replicated. The title, applied to this specific recording and this specific pair of artists, was exact in a way that went beyond the lyric. The song's title carried, for listeners who understood the context, an additional layer of meaning that extended beyond the lyric. You can't make old friends, and you can't make old partnerships, old creative relationships, old collaborations that have been through enough together to have produced something durable. You either have them or you don't. And if you have them, what you have is irreplaceable in the specific way that the song describes. Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton have not recorded together since. The sessions that might have produced another collaboration have not happened. Not because the relationship ended, but because careers move in directions that don't always align. Because schedules don't always cooperate. Because the circumstances that made Islands in the Stream possible in 1983 and You Can't Make Old Friends possible in 2013 have to come together in ways that can't be forced. What the 2013 session left behind was a record that worked both as music and as document. As music, it was warm, graceful, and assured. The work of two people who had been doing this long enough to make difficult things seem easy. As document, it was something rarer. Proof that the partnership was real, that the ease on the recording wasn't performed, that 30 years of shared history had produced exactly what the song said it produced. You can't make old friends. You can only be grateful for the ones you have. And on a day in 2013, in a recording studio, two people who had been old friends for 30 years made a record that said so. The song said what neither of them needed to say out loud. That was exactly the point.